The neighborhood looked calm on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, trouble was slowly brewing. It all started when a new neighbor moved into the house directly across the street. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She was the type of person who made herself known almost immediately, waving exaggeratedly at passing cars, introducing herself with forced cheer, and sprinkling her sentences with passive-aggressive remarks disguised as compliments. The rest of the neighbors quickly recognized her type, the kind of person who needed control, who thrived on attention, and who couldn't bear the thought of not being in charge of her surroundings. They called her a Karen, behind closed doors, and it didn't take long for her behavior to justify the nickname. The first sign of real conflict began when she started parking in front of her neighbor's driveway. At first, it seemed like a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize where the property lines were, or perhaps she had visitors and ran out of room in her own driveway. But when it kept happening, the pattern became clear. She wasn't running out of space. She was doing it deliberately. Her neighbor, the homeowner on the receiving end of this behavior, quickly grew tired of the inconvenience. Each time he tried to leave for work, he would find her car blocking the exit. He had to knock on her door, wait for her to shuffle outside, and endure a lecture about how driveways are public space. It wasn't just irritating, it was humiliating. At first, the homeowner tried to stay patient. He thought maybe she would stop once she realized how frustrating it was for someone else to be constantly trapped in their own property. But patience wasn't going to change anything. Instead of stopping, she began escalating. Soon, she was parking closer, making sure her car was positioned in such a way that maneuvering around it was impossible. On weekends, when guests visited, her car would remain firmly planted right across his drive, as though she were making a statement. It wasn't about convenience for her, it was about control. She wanted to send the message that she could park wherever she wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The other neighbors noticed, but they tried to avoid confrontation. They whispered about how petty it all seemed, but everyone knew Karen thrived on drama. She had already picked fights with the family next door about their recycling bins, had complained about the length of another neighbor's grass, and had even left handwritten notes on windshields criticizing how people parked too far from the curb. This was who she was, and now her latest target was the man whose driveway she blocked. The homeowner initially thought about calling the police, but he knew how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. Police involvement might stop her once or twice, but it wouldn't solve the root of the problem, and Karen, being who she was, would twist the story to make herself look like the victim. He decided instead to try subtle ways of discouraging her. He left polite reminders, small warning signs, and even cones at the edge of his driveway. But every attempt to claim his own space was met with defiance. The cones were kicked aside, the signs were ignored, and Karen began smirking when she saw him waiting behind her car, as if to say she enjoyed the power she held over his time and patience. Weeks passed, and the frustration turned into something more personal. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about refusing to be bullied in his own neighborhood. The homeowner knew something had to change. He couldn't spend his life being held hostage by someone else's car, someone else's arrogance. But what could he do that would finally end the cycle without dragging the entire neighborhood into a war? The answer came slowly, through observation. He noticed that Karen only stopped her behavior when she believed there was nothing more to gain from it. She thrived when people reacted, when they argued back, when they lost their temper. That was her fuel. To defeat her, he would need a solution that made her powerless, a strategy so airtight that she couldn't twist the narrative, couldn't find a loophole, and couldn't retaliate without making herself look ridiculous. It wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about construction. If she insisted on blocking his driveway, then he would turn his driveway into something she could never access again. The idea began as a small thought, but the more he considered it, the more it grew into something larger, something bold. He would build a fortress, not a literal castle, but a barrier so solid, so impossible to bypass, that Karen's little parking game would come to a sudden, humiliating end. It wouldn't just stop her, it would send a message that she had no power here, no control, and no claim over what wasn't hers. But before he could begin, he had to plan carefully. Building something too obvious would attract complaints from the HOA. Making it too aggressive could land him in legal trouble. The challenge was to construct something both perfectly within his rights and completely immune to her interference. He had to find the balance between protection and provocation. And as he began sketching designs, researching options, and talking quietly to contractors, the idea of the driveway fortress took shape. The first step was clear. He had to document everything. Every time Karen parked across his drive, he snapped photos. Every ignored sign, every cone knocked over, every moment he was trapped. He recorded it all. If the HOA or police ever came knocking, he would have a mountain of evidence on his side. And with that protection in place, he felt more confident moving forward. The day Karen saw the surveyors walking around his driveway, measuring and marking the edges, her smirk faltered. She stood on her lawn, arms crossed, glaring, but she said nothing. She was curious, suspicious, maybe even a little nervous. She wanted to know what was happening, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of an explanation. Instead, he let her stew in silence, knowing full well that curiosity would eat at her far more than any words could. For the first time since the conflict began, the power had shifted. Karen was no longer the one dictating the terms. Something was happening that she couldn't control, and deep down she must have known. It was only the beginning. The fortress was coming. The quiet rhythm of the neighborhood was broken. The morning trucks pulled up in front of the homeowner's house. Large utility vehicles, toolboxes clattering, and workers in hard hats stepped out with measuring tapes, drills, and heavy machinery. To most people, it would look like a normal home improvement project, but to Karen, it was a declaration of war. She stood across the street, glaring through her curtains as the men marked lines along the edges of the driveway, laid out stakes, and unloaded supplies. The sound of digging echoed down the road. Karen had spent weeks making her neighbor's life miserable by blocking his access, but now something much bigger was underway. She could sense it. This wasn't just a repair job. It was a counterattack. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. Curious eyes peeked from porches and windows as whispers moved from house to house. Everyone had seen the driveway drama unfold. Everyone knew about Karen's parking games. And now, everyone watched as the homeowner made his move. Some secretly cheered him on. Others braced themselves for the storm they knew Karen would unleash. The plan had been carefully crafted. The homeowner wasn't reckless. He knew any misstep would give Karen ammunition to turn the tables. That was why every step of the fortress project was perfectly legal. The design included reinforced steel bollards disguised as decorative posts, installed right at the edge of the driveway. They were sleek, tall, and painted to match the home's aesthetic, but their strength was undeniable. Once in place, no car could push past them. They weren't walls, but they might as well have been. In addition, a motorized gate was ordered, custom fit, heavy-duty, and impossible to tamper with. The gate wasn't just security, it was a statement. It said that the driveway was no longer public space, no longer vulnerable, and no longer Karen's playground. It was a fortress in every sense, locking out trouble while keeping the homeowner firmly in control. The first day of construction drew out Karen's predictable behavior. She paced back and forth along her lawn, pretending to water plants while sneaking glances at the work. Her arms flailed as she muttered to herself, clearly rehearsing complaints she would no doubt unleash later. By noon, she had stormed across the street under the guise of checking noise levels, her eyes darting over the workers' progress. She lingered too long, hovered too close, and when she realized she couldn't demand explanations, she huffed back into her house, slamming the door loud enough for half the street to hear. But the fortress kept rising. Concrete was poured too. Anchor the posts, and the outlines of the gate system began to take form. The homeowner stayed calm, nodding to the workers, reviewing blueprints, and never once acknowledging Karen's presence. His silence frustrated her more than any words ever could. She thrived on arguments, but when there was nothing to grab hold of, her anger had nowhere to go. By the second day, Karen escalated. She called the HOA. She left multiple messages insisting there was unauthorized construction happening on the street. She claimed the posts would ruin the visual harmony of the neighborhood. She even alleged that property values would plummet because of what she called an eyesore. The HOA responded with the usual process. They sent an inspector. But thanks to the homeowner's foresight, everything was in order. He had permits approved, designs filed, and every inch of the project aligned with local regulations. When the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, it only took a brief walk around the site to confirm that nothing was out of compliance. Karen hovered nearby, arms crossed, practically vibrating with frustration as the inspector nodded, shook the homeowner's hand, and drove away without issuing a single warning. That moment marked a turning point. The fortress wasn't just an idea anymore. It was inevitable. No amount of phone calls, no angry HOA complaints, no theatrical sighs on the lawn could stop it. For the first time since she started her parking campaign, Karen's tactics had no effect. She had met an opponent she couldn't intimidate. But Karen wasn't done. The fortress construction had turned her irritation into obsession. That night she paced by her window, her blinds twitching as she watched the dark outline of the posts drying in place. She scribbled notes on scraps of paper, planning her next move, trying to think of ways to sabotage or stall the progress. The fortress loomed over her thoughts, taunting her with the one thing she hated most: the loss of control. Meanwhile, the homeowner felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in months. Each new piece of steel, each turn of the drill, each cemented anchor felt like a victory. The frustration Karen had caused, the blocked mornings, the wasted time, the humiliation, was being erased with every hour of construction. Soon, he would be free from her interference forever. By the end of the week, the posts were fully secured, standing tall and immovable. They gleamed in the sunlight, strong and unshakable, a permanent reminder that the driveway was off limits. And as if that wasn't enough, the gate company arrived to install the massive barrier that would complete the project. Heavy iron bars slid into place, motorized arms tested their motion, and soon the fortress stood complete. The neighbors, who had quietly cheered from the sidelines, now had undeniable proof. Karen had lost. Some smirked behind their curtains. Others whispered congratulations when they passed by on their walks. The street, once a stage for her petty antics, was now a monument to her defeat. But Karen wasn't finished. Losing in public wasn't something she could accept. If she couldn't block the driveway physically, she would try to tear down the fortress symbolically. She began drafting letters, making threats and hinting at lawsuits. Her pride was wounded, and her obsession was growing. The homeowner, however, remained calm. The fortress wasn't just steel and concrete, it was a strategy. He knew she would lash out, but he was ready. Because the true power of the fortress wasn't in how it blocked Karen's car. It was in how it stripped away every excuse, every loophole, and every ounce of control she thought she had. Karen was furious. The homeowner was prepared. And the battle between them was only just beginning. Karen could not stand it. Every time she looked out her window, the fortress across the street mocked her. The tall posts, the heavy gate, the impenetrable barrier, they all represented her failure. She had spent months proving that she could control her neighbor's driveway, parking wherever she pleased, making his mornings miserable. Now, that power was gone. And for someone like Karen, losing power wasn't just frustrating, it was unbearable. The neighborhood sensed it. Everyone had seen the transformation of the driveway into a fortress, and everyone had seen Karen's face as she realized there was nothing she could do to stop it. Some neighbors quietly celebrated her defeat, whispering about how she had finally been put in her place. Others braced themselves, knowing that people like Karen never backed down without retaliation. They were right. Her revenge began with small, petty acts. She started leaving trash on the edge of the homeowner's lawn, just close enough to suggest it had blown over, but always suspiciously timed after she dragged her bins back inside. She parked her car on the street as close as possible, to the edge of his property, her bumper nearly brushing the posts of the fortress, as if daring him to complain. She even left her headlights on at night, pointed directly at his windows, trying to disturb his peace. But the fortress stood strong. Each petty attempt bounced off it like raindrops on steel. The homeowner didn't react. He didn't give her the satisfaction of outrage. Instead, he documented every piece of trash, every awkwardly parked car, every spotlight glare. He kept records, knowing Karen's behavior was building a case against her rather than against him. This silence only made her angrier. Karen thrived on conflict. Without an argument, without shouting matches, without visible frustration from her target, she was powerless. And so she escalated. Her first major attempt at revenge was vandalism. One night, under cover of darkness, she crept across the street with a can of spray paint. She thought she could deface the fortress, leaving behind ugly marks that would embarrass her neighbor and show the community she still had some kind of power. But what she didn't know was that the homeowner had prepared for this. The fortress wasn't just made of steel and iron, it was watched. Security cameras had been installed, discreet but effective, capturing every angle of the driveway and the street. When Karen lifted the spray can and made her first mark, the lens caught her in crisp, undeniable detail. By morning, the homeowner had the footage saved and stored in multiple locations. He didn't even rush to expose her right away. He let her think she had gotten away with it. When she stepped out the next day, expecting to see him scrubbing furiously. At the damage, she found the paint already cleaned, the surface pristine. She froze, realizing he had anticipated her move. And when she glanced up, she noticed the subtle gleam of a camera mounted above the gate. In that moment, the confidence drained from her face. She had been caught, and she knew it. But Karen wasn't finished. If she couldn't vandalize without consequence, she would escalate again. This time, she turned to the HOA. She filed formal complaints, claiming the fortress was unsafe, claiming it was an eyesore, claiming it violated the spirit of the neighborhood's design. She argued that the posts made the street feel like a prison, and that the gate disrupted the flow of the block. The HOA, obligated to investigate, sent another inspector. But just as before, every detail was perfectly legal. Permits had been approved, designs matched regulations, and even the color scheme blended with the home. The inspector filed the report with no violations. When the HOA dismissed her complaint, Karen's anger boiled over. She began sending out long emails to the neighborhood mailing list, filled with exaggerated claims and dramatic warnings about how the fortress would destroy property values. Most residents ignored her, but a few responded politely, reminding her that it was his property and he had the right to protect it. Those responses only fueled her obsession. She couldn't stand that no one was taking her side. The homeowner, meanwhile, stayed calm. The fortress had done more than block her car. It had blocked her influence. The more she fought, the more isolated she became. What once looked like power now looked like desperation. But Karen was relentless. Her next tactic was sabotage. Late one evening, she crept outside with a wrench, trying to loosen the bolts of one of the steel posts. She worked furiously, her face twisted with determination, convinced that if she could weaken the fortress, she could humiliate her neighbor. But again, the cameras caught everything. And this time, the homeowner didn't keep it to himself. The next morning, he sent the footage directly to the HOA and the local police. Within hours, Karen was confronted. She tried to spin the story, claiming she was just inspecting for safety. But the video showed the truth. She had been caught red-handed trying to damage someone else's property. The HOA issued her a warning for harassment. The police, though not pressing charges yet, made it clear that another incident could land her in serious legal trouble. For the first time, Karen's actions had real consequences. She wasn't just annoying anymore. She was exposed as a threat to the neighborhood. Humiliation burned through her. The fortress wasn't just standing physically. It was winning every battle, stripping her of her reputation and her influence. Neighbors who once tolerated her now avoided her. Whispers grew louder about her behavior, about her obsession, about how far she had gone to fight a battle she couldn't win. Still, Karen's pride wouldn't let her stop. Even after being caught, even after warnings, even after becoming the neighborhood outcast, she couldn't walk away. She told herself she had to win, had to prove she was right, had to destroy the fortress no matter what it took. But what she didn't realize was that every move she made only strengthened the homeowner's position. Every act of sabotage, every complaint, every tantrum was another piece of evidence, another reason for the HOA and the community to turn against her. The fortress hadn't just blocked her car, it had trapped her in her own obsession, and soon that obsession would push her to her breaking point. The fortress stood as strong as ever. Every steel post gleamed in the sunlight, every bolt was tight, and the motorized gate opened and closed with flawless precision. For the homeowner, life had returned to peace. He could enter and leave his driveway without obstruction, without waiting, without stress. But for Karen, the sight of that gate was unbearable. It represented everything she had lost. Her attempts to vandalize it had failed. Her complaints to the HOA had gone nowhere. Her sabotage attempts had been caught on camera. The neighborhood whispers had turned against her. And now, every time she glanced across the street, she saw the reminder that her control had vanished forever. The pressure built inside her like a storm cloud ready to burst. For weeks, she simmered, pacing her lawn, muttering angrily, glaring at anyone who dared cross her path. But anger like that doesn't stay hidden for long. Eventually, it erupts. It happened on a warm Saturday afternoon. Families were outside enjoying the sunshine. Children rode their bikes down the sidewalks and neighbors chatted casually in their front yards. The homeowner was washing his car behind the safety of his fortress gate, relaxed and unbothered. But Karen stood at her window, watching, fuming. The fortress wasn't just strong, it was mocking her, taunting her with every smooth motion of that gate sliding open and shut, and then she snapped. Karen stormed outside, her face twisted with rage, and marched across the street. She didn't care who was watching. She didn't care what anyone thought. She began shouting at the fortress, her voice cutting through the quiet afternoon air. The neighbors froze. Conversation stopped, bikes skidded to a halt, and all eyes turned toward her as she unleashed her fury. She ranted about selfishness, about how the fortress ruined the neighborhood, about how she had been personally victimized by its existence. Her voice cracked with fury, her hands flailed wildly, and she stomped her feet like a child throwing a tantrum. It was a full-blown meltdown, loud and dramatic, and it played out in front of the entire community. The homeowner, protected behind the gate, didn't respond. He simply continued washing his car, calm and collected, while the fortress shielded him from her chaos. His silence only fueled her anger. She pounded on the steel posts, rattling them uselessly, screaming louder, demanding attention. But the fortress did not move. The posts did not budge. The gate did not open. The neighbors watched in disbelief. Some recorded the scene on their phones. Others shook their heads, whispering about how far Karen had fallen. What once might have been dismissed as petty arguments was now undeniable proof. She had lost control of herself entirely. The meltdown escalated. She kicked at the posts. She hurled insults across the street. She waved her fists in the air as though fighting an invisible enemy. But the fortress stood immovable, unyielding, an unshakable wall against her rage, and the homeowner's calm. Demeanor behind it made her look even more unhinged. Finally, exhausted and red-faced, Karen realized no one was supporting her. No one was cheering her on. The neighbors she had expected to rally behind her were instead filming her embarrassment, capturing her meltdown for the world to see. With nothing left to throw at the fortress but her pride, she stormed back across the street, slamming her door so hard it rattled the windows. But the damage had already been done. Within hours, the videos of her outburst spread around the neighborhood. Group chats. Some neighbors uploaded clips online where they quickly gained traction. Karen had become a spectacle, not a leader. What she thought would be her moment of reclaiming power became the final nail in her reputation. The HOA soon got involved. With multiple complaints from residents about her behavior, along with footage of her meltdown, she was called into a meeting. Her defense was as dramatic as her outburst. She insisted she was being harassed by the fortress, that the homeowner had built it to target her personally. But with no evidence to support her claims, and with overwhelming proof of her harassment, the HOA issued her an official violation notice for disturbing the peace and damaging community harmony. The violation stung. Not only was her influence gone, but now she was on record as the problem neighbor. For someone who had spent months pretending to be the voice of authority, it was a humiliating reversal. She was no longer the enforcer of the neighborhood. She was its cautionary tale. Yet even after her meltdown and her violation notice, Karen couldn't let go. The fortress haunted her. She convinced herself that it wasn't just about a driveway anymore. It was about principle, about her right to control the space around her, about not being humiliated in front of her neighbors. Her obsession deepened. She stayed up late writing angry emails, drafting letters, and ranting to anyone who would listen. But fewer and fewer people were willing to engage. The fortress had done more than protect a driveway. It had exposed Karen for who she truly was. Without the ability to block cars and dictate rules, she had nothing left but her temper. And now, everyone had seen it. Still, pride wouldn't let her stop. She began plotting again, determined to find a way to tear down what she saw as her greatest enemy. She told herself that if she couldn't fight the fortress directly, she would attack indirectly. Whether through legal loopholes, new complaints, or backhanded schemes, Karen wasn't done. She couldn't be, because for her, this wasn't just about losing control of a driveway. It was about losing control of her identity. And soon, her obsession would push her into even riskier territory, dragging her further down a path she couldn't escape. Karen's meltdown had left a stain she couldn't scrub away. The neighborhood no longer saw her as a voice of authority, but as the woman who lost her temper at a driveway. The HOA's violation notice had only confirmed what everyone already knew. Karen was no longer the enforcer. She was the problem. But humiliation didn't end her obsession. Instead, it drove her deeper into it. The fortress had beaten her in every way possible, physically, socially, and even legally. And now, every time she glanced across the street, she saw her failure staring back at her in steel and concrete. To her, it wasn't just a driveway barrier. It was a monument to her defeat. And Karen couldn't stand to be defeated. Her desperation grew in silence at first. She spent nights scrolling online forums, searching for loopholes in HOA rules, reading about zoning disputes, digging for any weapon she could use against the fortress. But everything came up empty. The homeowner had done his homework too well. Every permit was in place, every design aligned with regulations, every detail was protected. There was no legal angle for her to exploit. So she turned to riskier ideas. The first scheme involved sabotage through proxy. Late at night, she called the city to report construction hazards around the property. She claimed the posts weren't secured properly, that the gate motors were unsafe, and that it posed a danger to children in the neighborhood. But when inspectors arrived, everything was flawless. Not only was the fortress safe, it was safer than most of the driveways in the area. Her false reports were dismissed, and her credibility slipped further. Next, she tried to rally other neighbors. She knocked on doors, ranting about how the fortress ruined the look of the block and how it set a dangerous precedent for others to build whatever they wanted. But one by one, the neighbors politely turned her away. Some didn't answer the door at all. Others listened quietly, but refused to sign her petitions. Most of them had grown tired of her antics long ago. They were grateful that the fortress had ended the driveway drama, and no one wanted to reignite the conflict. Every rejection chipped away at Karen's pride. She had always believed she could bend the community to her will, that she could manipulate the HOA and her neighbors to follow her lead. But now, no one followed. She was alone. And then, her obsession drove her to recklessness. One night, just past midnight, Karen crept out of her house carrying a crowbar. Her eyes darted up and down the street, checking for witnesses. The fortress stood silent and unyielding under the glow of the streetlights, its steel posts casting long shadows across the pavement. She approached slowly, gripping the crowbar, tight, determined to damage the gate mechanism. She swung once, twice, striking the edge of the motor box with all her strength. Sparks flew, but the casing held strong. She swung again, grunting in frustration, but no matter how hard she hit, the fortress didn't break. Her crowbar only left scratches, nothing more. What Karen didn't know was that the homeowner had upgraded his security after her earlier sabotage attempt. The cameras weren't just recording, they were live streaming to a private security system. And as Karen swung her crowbar into the gate, the silent alarm triggered. Within minutes, flashing lights cut through the night as a patrol car pulled up, headlights flooding the scene. Karen froze, caught mid-swing, crowbar in hand. The officer stepped out, demanding explanations. She stammered excuses, claiming she was testing the safety of the structure, but the evidence was undeniable. The crowbar, the damage, the video footage, all of it painted a clear picture. She wasn't inspecting, she was attacking. The homeowner, alerted by the alarm, stepped outside. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise his voice. The fortress and the cameras spoke for him. The officers took down statements, issued citations, and made it clear that another incident like this could end in arrest. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Word spread quickly. Karen had been caught red-handed, trying to destroy the very fortress that had defeated her. Any remaining sympathy she might have had evaporated. The whispers turned into open disdain. She wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was a danger. Parents warned their kids to stay away from her house. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. She had isolated herself completely, but even then, Karen's pride wouldn't let her stop. She stewed inside her house, blinds drawn, convinced the fortress was ruining her life. In her mind, she wasn't the villain. She was the victim. She told herself she was fighting for principle, for fairness, for her right to control her street. But the truth was clear to everyone else. She was fighting a losing battle against her own obsession. The homeowner, meanwhile, lived in peace. His fortress had done more than protect his driveway. It had protected his sanity. He no longer worried about being blocked in. He no longer dealt with wasted mornings or petty confrontations. And with Karen's reputation in ruins, he no longer feared her influence. But Karen's story wasn't over yet. Her desperation had pushed her to vandalism, to public meltdowns, to reckless sabotage. And though she had been caught and warned, she still couldn't let go. She believed she had one last chance, one last move that could restore her pride and destroy the fortress once and for all. What she didn't realize was that her final act of desperation wouldn't just fail. It would seal her downfall forever. Karen's reputation was in ruins. The neighbors had seen her tantrums, her sabotage attempts, and even her late-night crowbar attack on the fortress. She was no longer the self-appointed neighborhood authority. She was the outcast, the troublemaker, the cautionary tale everyone whispered about. But even then, Karen couldn't accept defeat. Pride and obsession blinded her to reality. In her mind, there was still a chance to reclaim control, to destroy the fortress that stood as a monument to her failure. And so, in the shadows of her humiliation, she began planning one final move. She told herself this would be the end, the moment she finally toppled the fortress and proved to the neighborhood that she was right all along. She convinced herself it was about principle, about restoring order to the street. But deep down, it wasn't about principle at all. It was about pride. The plan was reckless from the start. Karen decided to hire outside help. She whispered to acquaintances, offering small amounts of cash to teenagers in the area, promising them rewards if they could mess with the fortress. Most ignored her. Some laughed in her face. But one night she managed to coax a pair of older kids into following her across the street. Armed with spray paint, eggs, and tools, they joined her in her final act of defiance. Together, they crept toward the fortress under the cover of darkness. Karen pointed with wild gestures, urging them to leave their marks, to damage what they could, to help her tear down what she hated most. But what Karen hadn't considered was that the fortress wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a fully fortified system. The cameras caught every angle. The silent alarms tripped again. Motion-activated lights exploded to life, flooding the driveway in harsh white beams. The kids panicked immediately, dropping their cans and tools, sprinting away into the night. But Karen froze, caught in the spotlight like a thief on stage. Within minutes, the police arrived. This time, they weren't just responding to a complaint. They had a record of repeated incidents, multiple warnings, and undeniable footage. The teenagers had fled, but Karen was left holding the evidence in her hands, a spray can still dripping. Paint, her fingerprints covering it. The officers confronted her on the spot. She tried the same excuses as before, insisting she was protecting the neighborhood, insisting the fortress was a hazard, insisting she was the victim. But no one believed her anymore. The fortress stood tall behind her, spotless and unshaken, while she looked small and frantic in its shadow. The decision was swift. Karen was charged with trespassing and attempted vandalism. Unlike her earlier warnings, this time there were real consequences. Fines were issued, court dates were scheduled, and for the first time, Karen faced the possibility of a criminal record. The neighborhood erupted in whispers the next morning. Word spread quickly. Karen had been caught again, this time with no room for excuses. Some neighbors were relieved, others were amused. But all of them agreed on one thing. The fortress had finally broken her. The HOA, tired of her constant complaints and disruptions, voted to fine her for harassment and property damage. They even discussed removing her from the board she had once dominated. For someone who had built her identity on being the neighborhood enforcer, it was the ultimate humiliation. Meanwhile, the homeowner carried on with his life in peace. The fortress stood tall, unshaken by Karen's attacks, a permanent reminder that he had reclaimed control of his own property. He never gloated, never boasted, never rubbed it in her face. He didn't need to. The fortress itself told the story. It was the symbol of victory, the line that Karen could never cross again. As the weeks passed, Karen's presence on the street faded. She drew her blinds, avoided neighbors, and stopped her usual patrols. Her obsession had cost her everything: her influence, her reputation, and even her sense of control over her own life. The fortress hadn't just defeated her driveway games, it had exposed her obsession, her pride, and her inability to let go. The neighbors moved on. Children rode their bikes again, families walked their dogs, and the street felt lighter without Karen's constant interference. And every time someone passed by the fortress, they saw not just steel posts and a gate, but the story of how one man stood up to a bully and won without ever raising his voice. Karen, however, never recovered her former role. She remained isolated, a shadow of the self-important figure she had once been, and the fortress stood tall as a daily reminder, not just to her, but to everyone, that respect for boundaries matters, and that arrogance and obsession only lead to downfall. In the end, the fortress wasn't just a barrier of steel and iron. It was a barrier against control, against manipulation, against the petty tyranny of a Karen who believed the street belonged to her. It was proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting. It's building something so unbreakable that your enemy can't touch it, no matter how hard they try. And so, the story closed with the fortress standing strong, Karen, left powerless, and the neighborhood finally free from her chaos. The fortress had won.